My name is Aurora Chen, and I'm 34 years old. This is the story of how my mother-in-law's cruelest act became the spark that ignited my greatest triumph. It began with flames, real flames that devoured everything I held sacred, while I stood beside my mother's grave, unaware that miles away, the woman who claimed to love my husband was systematically destroying the life we had built together. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Some people say revenge is a dish best served cold. I disagree. Sometimes revenge burns brightest when it's been carefully tended, fed by years of quiet determination, and finally unleashed when your enemy least expects it. This is that story. The morning my mother died, I thought I knew what grief felt like. I was wrong. Grief, I would learn, has layers. The surface grief hits you like a sledgehammer, sudden and crushing. But beneath that lies something deeper, more corrosive. The grief that comes from betrayal, from having your sanctuary violated while you're at your most vulnerable. Margaret Hartwell, my mother-in-law, had always worn her disapproval of me like expensive jewelry, polished, prominent, and impossible to ignore. From the moment her son David brought me home, she made it clear that I was a temporary inconvenience in her perfectly curated world. I was too ethnic, too ambitious, too different from the porcelain-skinned debutante she had envisioned for her golden boy. David, bless his heart, defended me when he was around, but Margaret was cunning. She saved her venom for when he wasn't listening, delivered with surgical precision during family dinners and holiday gatherings. Little comments about my career, my heritage, my clothes, my cooking. Death by 1,000 cuts, each one small enough to seem insignificant if I dared to complain. For 6 years, I endured it. 6 years of gritted teeth and forced smiles, because I loved David more than I hated her poison. I thought if I could just be patient enough, kind enough, successful enough, she might eventually accept me. I was naive enough to believe that love could melt the ice around her heart. The call came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in November. My mother had suffered a massive stroke. By the time I reached the hospital in Phoenix, she was already gone. Just like that, the woman who had sacrificed everything to give me a better life was reduced to a still form under sterile white sheets. David held me as I sobbed in that antiseptic hallway, whispering promises that everything would be okay, that we would get through this together. He had to stay behind in Seattle for a crucial business presentation that could make or break his architectural firm, but he would join me for the funeral in 3 days. Margaret offered to help coordinate things from Seattle, to handle any emergencies at our house while we were both away. I should have known better. I should have remembered that Margaret Hartwell never offered help without expecting something in return. But grief makes you stupid, makes you grateful for any gesture that resembles kindness. My mother's funeral was small but beautiful. She had requested a simple ceremony in the church where she had prayed every Sunday for 40 years, surrounded by the tight-knit community of immigrants who had become her chosen family. They shared stories of her generosity, her fierce protection of her daughter, her dreams of seeing me succeed beyond anything she could have imagined for herself. As I stood beside her casket, I promised her that I would continue making her proud. I had no idea that at that very moment, 3 states away, Margaret was making sure I would have nothing left to build that promise upon. David's call came as I was selecting flowers for the gravesite. His voice was strange, hollow in a way I had never heard before. "Aurora, you need to come home, now." The line crackled with static, or maybe it was the sound of my world beginning to fracture. "What's wrong? What happened?" "Just come home. I'll explain everything when you get here." The 6-hour drive from Phoenix to Seattle felt like an eternity. Every mile stretched longer than the last, my imagination conjuring disasters ranging from a break-in to David having an affair. Nothing could have prepared me for what I found when I pulled into our driveway. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Acrid, chemical, wrong. Then I saw the black scorch marks on our garage door, the windows of our home blackened with soot. David stood in the doorway looking like he had aged 10 years in 3 days, his face a mask of devastation and rage. "She said there was an electrical fire," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. She called the fire department, called me at work, said she tried to save what she could, but everything happened so fast. I pushed past him into what used to be our living room. The walls were intact, but everything else was gone. The hand-carved dining table David had made for our first anniversary, the silk curtains my mother had sewn as a housewarming gift, my grandmother's antique jewelry box, the photo albums chronicling our courtship, our wedding, our dreams. But it wasn't random. As I walked through the charred remains of our home, a pattern emerged that made my blood turn to ice. The fire had been surgical, precise. David's belongings were largely untouched. His awards, his drafting table, his collection of vintage architectural books. The flames had somehow known to avoid anything that mattered to him. My things, however, had been consumed with thorough efficiency. My diplomas from law school burned to ash. The quilt my mother had made for my wedding reduced to blackened threads. The family photos that couldn't be replaced. The letters my grandmother had written me before she died, the jewelry that had been passed down through 3 generations of strong women who had fought to give me this life. "Where is she?" I asked David, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "She went home. She was traumatized by the whole thing. Aurora, I'm so sorry. The insurance will cover everything. We can rebuild." Rebuild? As if the irreplaceable could simply be ordered from a catalog. As if the tangible connections to my heritage, my history, my heart could be restored with a phone call and a check. I found Margaret in her pristine Tudor home across town, sitting in her spotless living room, sipping tea from bone china that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She looked up when I entered, and for just a split second, I saw something flicker across her face. Not guilt, not remorse, but satisfaction. "Aurora, dear," she said, rising gracefully, "I'm so sorry about the fire. These old houses, you know."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The wiring can be so unpredictable. I studied her face, searching for cracks in the performance. Her gray hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her expression composed in practiced sympathy. But her eyes held a glitter of triumph that she couldn't quite hide. "How did it start?" I asked quietly. "Oh, you know how these things happen. I was checking on the house like I promised, and I smelled something burning from the kitchen. By the time I called the fire department, the flames had spread so quickly. I did my best to save what I could, but—" She gestured helplessly, a masterful display of regret. "What did you save?" "Mostly David's things from his office. I grabbed what I could carry, but the smoke was so thick, and I'm not as young as I used to be." Of course, David's things. The son's possessions were rescued while the daughter-in-law's life burned to ash. How convenient. How perfectly, impossibly convenient. "The strangest thing," I continued, watching her face carefully, "the fire investigator said it looked like it started in multiple locations, almost like accelerant had been used." For just a moment, her composure slipped. Her teacup rattled against its saucer before she steadied it. "Well, I'm sure they know what they're talking about. These professionals have seen everything." I stood up, smoothing my black funeral dress. "You're right, they have seen everything, including arson." Margaret's face went pale, but she recovered quickly. "Aurora, you're grieving. You've just lost your mother, and now this terrible accident. Perhaps you should see someone. Talk to a professional about these paranoid thoughts." Paranoid thoughts? She was already laying the groundwork, already positioning me as the unstable daughter-in-law driven to delusions by grief. It was masterfully done, the kind of gaslighting that comes from decades of practice. But as I walked back to my car, as I drove through the city streets toward the hotel where David and I would now be living temporarily, I felt something crystallizing inside my chest. Not the raw, chaotic grief of losing my mother, or the shocked devastation of seeing my home destroyed. This was something colder, more purposeful. Margaret Hartwell had finally crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She had burned my past, thinking she could erase my place in her son's future. What she had actually done was forge something harder, more dangerous than she had ever imagined possible. That night, lying in the sterile hotel room beside my sleeping husband, I made a promise to my mother's memory, to my grandmother's jewelry that no longer existed, to every woman in my lineage who had fought to give me the opportunities they never had. Margaret wanted to see me disappear from her son's life. She wanted to erase every trace of who I was and where I came from. Fine, I would disappear. But when I resurfaced, it would be as someone she never saw coming. Someone with the power to take everything she held dear and watch it burn with the same methodical precision she had used on my life. The insurance investigation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of living in hotels, of replacing documents, of watching David struggle with the knowledge that his mother might not be the woman he thought she was. 3 weeks of Margaret's perfectly timed visits, her gentle suggestions that maybe this was the universe's way of giving us a fresh start. Maybe we should move closer to family. Maybe I should take some time off work to process the trauma. She was good, I had to give her that. She never explicitly suggested that I was to blame for attracting such misfortune, never directly implied that her son would be better off without me. She just created a steady drip of poison, subtle enough that David couldn't pinpoint what was wrong, but persistent enough to plant seeds of doubt. The fire investigator, a weathered man named Detective Rodriguez, called me on a Friday evening. "Mrs. Chen, I wanted to give you an update on our investigation." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What did you find?" "Well, it's inconclusive. There are some unusual burn patterns, and we found traces of what might be accelerant in multiple locations. But there's no direct evidence of arson, and the witness, your mother-in-law, maintains that she discovered the fire and attempted to help." Witness, not suspect. Witness. "However," he continued, "I want you to know that in my 20 years of investigating fires, I've developed instincts about these things. If you ever find concrete evidence, any evidence at all, don't hesitate to call me." After I hung up, I sat in the hotel bathroom and stared at my reflection in the harsh fluorescent lighting. My face had aged in the past month. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there before, a hardness to my jaw that spoke of teeth clenched too often, too long. Margaret thought she had won. She thought she had broken me, sent me scurrying back to whatever hole she believed I had crawled out of. She had no idea that she had actually done me the greatest favor of my life. Because for the first time since I had married her son, I stopped trying to win her approval. I stopped caring what she thought of me, stopped hoping that kindness and persistence might eventually thaw her frozen heart. She had shown me exactly who she was, and I finally believed her. The plan began to form, slowly, carefully, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. It would take time, patience, and resources I didn't yet have. But I had something Margaret didn't expect me to have. Nothing left to lose, and everything to gain. David threw himself into rebuilding our life with the kind of desperate energy that comes from guilt he couldn't quite name. He designed us a beautiful new house, twice as large as the old one, with custom features and luxury finishes that were meant to replace what we had lost. He couldn't understand why I seemed distant, why I didn't share his excitement about fresh starts and new beginnings. How could I explain that you can't rebuild what was stolen, only replace it with something different? The new house was beautiful, but it would never hold the smell of my mother's cooking or the warmth of my grandmother's quilt. It would never contain the photos of my family's journey from poverty to stability, the tangible proof of how far we had come. Margaret, meanwhile, played the role of concerned mother-in-law to perfection. She helped us choose furniture, offered family heirlooms to fill the empty spaces, suggested that maybe this was an opportunity to start fresh with a more cohesive aesthetic. Translation: now I could finally erase the last traces of Aurora's foreign influence and turn my son's home into something properly American. I let her think she was winning. I smiled and nodded and graciously accepted her suggestions, all while building something she couldn't see. During the day, I returned to my job at the law firm, handling corporate mergers and acquisitions with the same methodical precision I was applying to my personal life. But at night, while David slept beside me in our temporary bed, I was learning everything there was to know about Margaret Hartwell. She wasn't just a wealthy widow living off her deceased husband's insurance money. She was a small-time real estate investor who had been lucky enough to buy properties in neighborhoods that later became desirable. She owned 12 rental units across the city, all of them managed through a property management company that charged premium rates to young professionals who didn't know they were being overcharged. She also served on the board of several charities, positions that gave her social standing but very little actual power. She volunteered at the country club, organized fundraisers for causes she didn't particularly care about, and generally spent her time maintaining the illusion that she was more important than she actually was. But Margaret had vulnerabilities: credit card debt that she hid from David, tax problems that she had been ignoring for years, and a lifestyle that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as property values shifted and her rental income decreased. She was house rich but cash poor, a situation she concealed behind expensive clothes and careful social positioning. More importantly, she had made enemies. Tenants who felt exploited, charity board members who resented her controlling nature, social rivals who were tired of her condescending attitude. People who would be happy to share information about Margaret Hartwell with someone who asked the right questions in the right way. 6 months after the fire, I made my first move. It was small, almost insignificant. I convinced David that we should invest in real estate, that property could be a hedge against future disasters. He thought it was brilliant, was proud of his wife for turning trauma into smart financial planning. What he didn't know was that I had identified 3 of Margaret's rental properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods, properties she had been neglecting, allowing to deteriorate while she raised the rent beyond what the market would support. I started making offers through shell companies, quietly acquiring the buildings at prices that forced Margaret to choose between taking a loss or keeping properties she couldn't afford to maintain. She chose the money, of course. She had no choice. But each sale chipped away at her rental income, her financial security, her ability to maintain the lifestyle she used to support her sense of superiority. I was patient, methodical. I learned from corporate law that the best victories come from making your opponent defeat themselves, from creating situations where their own weaknesses become their downfall. Margaret had spent years underestimating me, dismissing me as some immigrant's daughter who had gotten lucky enough to marry above her station. She was about to learn exactly how expensive that mistake would be. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos had been one of Margaret's tenants for 3 years, a single mother trying to raise 2 kids in a studio apartment that Margaret charged $1,500 a month for. The heat barely worked, the plumbing was a disaster, and Margaret refused to make repairs while demanding rent increases every 6 months. Maria had been documenting everything, keeping photos and records of every maintenance request that was ignored, every phone call that went unreturned, every excuse Margaret made for why a mother and 2 children should live in substandard conditions. She was building a case for a lawsuit she couldn't afford to file. I could afford it. I also could afford to purchase Maria's building, to renovate it properly, and to offer her a lease at actual market rate instead of the inflated price Margaret had been charging. Maria was grateful, so grateful that she was happy to share every piece of documentation she had been collecting about Margaret's business practices. It was a gold mine. Evidence of housing code violations, tenant harassment, fraudulent repair charges, and rental practices that bordered on illegal. Enough evidence to destroy Margaret's reputation and her rental income permanently. But I wasn't ready to use it yet. I was still building, still positioning pieces on a chessboard that Margaret didn't even know she was playing on. The second year after the fire, David and I hosted Thanksgiving dinner in our new house. Margaret arrived early, as she always did, to inspect our preparations and offer unsolicited improvements. She walked through our rebuilt life like a queen surveying her domain, pointing out places where she thought we could do better. "The dining room feels a bit empty," she mused, running her fingers along the table David had crafted to replace the one she had burned. David as a child, not David and Aurora as a couple, not our wedding photos, which had all been destroyed in the fire she had set. Just David, alone, before I had contaminated his perfect life with my presence. I smiled and nodded and served her dinner on the china she had chosen, all while mentally cataloging every slight, every dismissal, every reminder that in her mind I would always be a temporary guest in my own life. After dinner, while David was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher, Margaret cornered me in the living room.
She had been drinking wine all evening, and the alcohol had loosened her tongue in ways that her usual careful control wouldn't have allowed. "You know," she said, settling into the armchair that had been positioned to give her the best view of the room, "I'm proud of how you've bounced back from that terrible fire. It takes real resilience to rebuild after losing everything." "Thank you," I replied carefully. "Of course, it's easier when you don't have much to lose to begin with." The words hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and unmistakable. I mean, when you come from nothing, starting over is just returning to your natural state. There it was, the truth she had been hiding behind polite smiles and charitable concern. In Margaret's mind, I deserved to have my life burned down because people like me didn't deserve to have nice things in the first place. I looked at her sitting in my living room, drinking my wine, passing judgment on my worthiness to exist in the life I had built through education, hard work, and sacrifices she couldn't begin to imagine. And I felt something shift inside me, like tumblers falling into place in a lock. "You're absolutely right," I said quietly. "It is easier to start over when you're used to having nothing. It teaches you to be resourceful, to find opportunity in the most unexpected places." Margaret nodded approvingly, pleased that I was finally acknowledging my place in the hierarchy she had constructed. She had no idea that I was talking about her. 2 years and 4 months after Margaret burned down my life, I was ready to return the favor. But unlike her crude, destructive approach, my fire would be precise, legal, and absolutely devastating. It started with Maria's lawsuit. As her attorney, I filed a comprehensive case against Margaret for housing discrimination, tenant harassment, and fraudulent business practices. The evidence was overwhelming, documented meticulously by a tenant who had been pushed too far by a landlord who thought her victims had no power to fight back. The media picked up the story immediately. "Local socialite accused of exploiting immigrant families," read the headline in the Seattle Times. The article included photos of the substandard housing conditions and quotes from multiple tenants who had been afraid to speak up individually but found courage in numbers. Margaret's social standing crumbled overnight. The charity boards quietly asked for her resignation. The country club suggested she take a temporary leave from her volunteer positions. Friends who had smiled at her fundraisers suddenly became too busy to return her calls. But that was just the beginning. While Margaret was dealing with the public relations disaster of the lawsuit, I was systematically dismantling her financial foundation. The shell companies I had established began making strategic property purchases, driving up prices in her remaining rental markets and making it impossible for her to compete. Her tenants, emboldened by Maria's success, started demanding repairs she couldn't afford and withholding rent she desperately needed. Within 6 months, Margaret was forced to sell 4 more properties at a loss. Within a year, she was down to her last 3 rental units, all of them money pits that cost more to maintain than they generated in income. She tried to reach out to David, to hint that she was having financial difficulties without admitting the extent of her problems. But David had been following the lawsuit in the papers, had seen the evidence of how his mother had been treating vulnerable families. He was horrified, ashamed, and for the first time in his life, he began to see his mother clearly. "I had no idea," he told me one evening, staring at photos of the conditions Margaret's tenants had been living in.
"I knew she could be difficult, but this is cruel." I held his hand and made appropriate sympathetic sounds, all while mentally calculating how much longer it would take to complete Margaret's destruction. I had learned patience from her, after all. She had taken years to chip away at my confidence and belonging. I could afford to take my time returning the favor. The final blow came in the form of a tax audit. Not the random kind that sometimes happens to ordinary citizens, but the thorough, comprehensive kind that happens when someone provides detailed information about potential tax evasion to the right government agencies. Information like records showing rental income that had never been reported, repair expenses that had been claimed but never actually spent, and charitable donations that existed only on paper. Information that someone with access to corporate financial records would know how to compile and present in exactly the format that would trigger the most intensive investigation possible. Margaret hired lawyers she couldn't afford to fight charges she couldn't deny.
The IRS doesn't care about your social standing or your charity work when you owe them money you don't have. They just want payment, with interest and penalties that grow every day you can't provide it. The house went on the market first. The beautiful Tudor home where Margaret had served me tea and lies, where she had planned my destruction while wearing the mask of concerned family. I watched from my car as strangers toured the property, as the for sale sign went up, as Margaret's sanctuary was reduced to just another real estate listing. David was worried about his mother, wanted to help her financially. I gently reminded him that we were still rebuilding our own lives, that we had our own mortgage and expenses to consider. I suggested that maybe this was an opportunity for Margaret to downsize, to find a lifestyle more suited to her actual means rather than the fantasy she had been living. He agreed, reluctantly, because he trusted his wife's financial judgment, because I had proven to be smart with money, strategic with investments, careful with the future we were building together. If only he knew. Margaret's final rental property sold on a Tuesday in March, exactly 3 years after she had burned down my life. I happened to be in the neighborhood that morning, having coffee at a cafe across the street, when I saw her standing on the sidewalk looking up at the building that had been her last source of income. She looked smaller than I remembered, older. The expensive clothes had been replaced with off-the-rack outfits that didn't quite fit right. Her hair, once professionally styled every week, was showing gray roots that spoke of beauty appointments she could no longer afford. For just a moment, I felt something that might have been pity. She was an old woman who had lost everything, who was facing the kind of uncertainty she had never imagined possible. But then I remembered the look of satisfaction on her face as she sipped tea in her pristine living room while my life burned around me. I remembered her cold dismissal of my grief, her casual cruelty disguised as concern. Pity evaporated like morning fog. Margaret never knew that I was the architect of her downfall. She blamed bad luck, the economy, unfair persecution by ungrateful tenants. She moved into a studio apartment in a neighborhood she had once looked down on, accepting charity from organizations she had once patronized. David visited her occasionally, bringing groceries and small checks that barely covered her utilities. He felt guilty about his mother's circumstances, kept wondering if there was more he could do to help. I supported his kindness while privately calculating how long Margaret's savings would last, how many months she had before even the studio apartment became unaffordable. The last time I saw her was at David's birthday dinner, a small gathering at our house because Margaret couldn't afford to host family celebrations anymore. She sat at our table, eating food prepared in the kitchen that had replaced the one she burned, surrounded by photos and mementos that had replaced the irreplaceable things she had destroyed. She was quiet that night, diminished in ways that went beyond her reduced circumstances. The sharp edges that had once made her so dangerous were dulled by dependency, by the knowledge that her social power was gone, that her opinions no longer mattered to anyone. As I cleared the dishes after dinner, she approached me in the kitchen. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, quietly, she said, "You've done well for yourself, Aurora. David is lucky to have you." It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get from Margaret Hartwell, an acknowledgement that I belonged in her son's life, that I had earned my place in his world. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt hollow, incomplete. Because Margaret still didn't know what she had cost me, still didn't understand the magnitude of what she had destroyed. In her mind, she had lost a battle to bad luck and changing circumstances. She had no idea that she had lost a war to an enemy she had created through her own cruelty. That night, as I lay beside my sleeping husband in the house we had rebuilt from the ashes of Margaret's hatred, I realized something that surprised me. The revenge was complete, but it hadn't healed the wound. Margaret's destruction hadn't brought back my mother's quilt or my grandmother's jewelry. It hadn't restored the photos that contained the only visual proof of my family's journey, the documents that told the story of how far we had come. Revenge, I learned, is its own kind of fire. It burns hot and bright and consumes everything in its path. But when the flames die down, when the smoke clears, you're left standing in a landscape that's been permanently changed, not restored, just different. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't bring myself to regret the choices I had made. Margaret had taught me that kindness could be mistaken for weakness, that turning the other cheek only gave your enemies a better target. She had shown me that sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to become more dangerous than the people who want to hurt you. And in the end, wasn't that its own kind of education? The kind of lesson that can only be learned through fire, whether you're the one who lights the match or the one who rises from the ashes. Margaret Hartwell had tried to erase me from her son's life by burning away everything that made me who I was. Instead, she had forged me into someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than the naive young woman who had once hoped to win her approval. Some fires destroy, others transform. The difference, I had learned, is not in the flames themselves, but in what remains standing when the burning is done. And I was still standing. The phone call that changed everything came on a Wednesday morning in October, 4 years after Margaret's world had crumbled into dust. I was reviewing contracts in my corner office, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Seattle skyline, when my secretary buzzed through the intercom. "Mrs. Chen, there's a woman on line 3 who says she's your mother-in-law. She sounds quite distressed." Margaret, calling me directly for the first time in years, bypassing David entirely. Whatever had driven her to pick up that phone and dial my number had to be desperate indeed. "Put her through." The voice that came through the speaker was nothing like the commanding presence I remembered. It was thin, shaky, stripped of all the authority that had once made me feel small in her presence. "Aurora, I need to speak with you. In person, today if possible." "What about?" A long pause. I could hear traffic in the background, the ambient noise of a public phone or a busy street. Margaret, who had once orchestrated her life from the comfort of her pristine home, was calling me from somewhere decidedly less refined. "I can't discuss it over the phone."
Please, just 30 minutes of your time. The desperation in her voice was intoxicating. After years of her treating me like an inconvenience, like something unpleasant that had wandered into her perfectly ordered life, Margaret Hartwell was begging for my attention. The Pioneer Square Starbucks, 3 o'clock. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner, positioned so I could watch Margaret enter. She walked through the door at exactly 3 o'clock, and I almost didn't recognize her. The woman who had once dominated every room she entered now moved with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned that confidence was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her coat was clean but worn, the kind of garment you find at discount stores when designer labels are no longer in the budget. Her hair, once her pride and joy, was thin and clearly cut at a chain salon. But it was her posture that told the real story. Margaret's shoulders were curved inward, her head slightly bowed, her entire demeanor that of someone who had been beaten down by circumstances beyond her control. She spotted me and approached with the hesitant gait of a supplicant. When she sat across from me, I noticed the tremor in her hands as she placed them flat on the table. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want, Margaret?" She flinched slightly at my directness, perhaps remembering when I had been more deferential, more willing to cushion my words to preserve her feelings. Those days were long gone. "I need a job." The words hung between us like a confession. Margaret Hartwell, who had never worked a day in her privileged life, who had looked down on me for having a career, was asking me for employment. "I'm 72 years old," she continued, staring at her folded hands. "I never thought I would be in this position. The Social Security isn't enough, and David, he's been helping when he can, but I can't keep taking money from my son. I won't." There was something almost admirable about that last statement, a flash of the pride that had once made her so formidable. But pride doesn't pay rent or buy groceries, and we both knew it. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything. Reception, filing, cleaning. I know it's not much to offer, but I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to do whatever needs to be done." Margaret Hartwell, who had once dismissed entire categories of people as beneath her notice, was now volunteering to join their ranks. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt scripted. I leaned back in my chair and studied her face.
The bone structure was still there, the genetic architecture that had made her a beauty in her youth, but time and hardship had carved away everything soft, leaving behind something sharp and desperate. Why come to me? Why not apply to other companies? Her laugh was bitter, hollow. Do you think I haven't tried? I'm a 72-year-old woman with no work experience and a reputation for being difficult. Who's going to hire someone like me? A reputation for being difficult. That was one way to describe what happened when your decades of treating service workers with contempt came back to haunt you. Margaret had burned bridges throughout the city, alienated people who might have been willing to help if she had shown them basic human decency when she had power over them. I know you have every reason to hate me, she continued, her voice growing stronger with what might have been courage or desperation. I know I wasn't kind to you when you married David. I know I made your life harder than it should have been. Wasn't kind, made life harder. The euphemisms were almost insulting in their inadequacy. Margaret had spent years trying to drive me away from her son, had destroyed everything I owned when I was at my most vulnerable, had attempted to erase my place in my own marriage. But she was here, hat in hand, begging for mercy from the woman she had tried to destroy. The poetic justice was so exquisite, I had to fight to keep the satisfaction from showing on my face. Why should I help you? Because you're a better person than I am. The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were flattering, but because they revealed the depth of Margaret's fall. The woman who had once believed herself superior to everyone around her was now positioning herself as morally inferior to the daughter-in-law she had spent years trying to eliminate. I let the silence stretch until Margaret began to fidget, until the weight of my consideration became unbearable for her. There might be something, I said finally. It's not glamorous work. It would involve long hours, difficult people, and a salary that's barely above minimum wage. I'll take it. You haven't heard what it is yet. It doesn't matter. I'll take whatever you're willing to give me. Whatever I was willing to give her. Margaret had just handed me absolute power over her life, had made herself completely dependent on my mercy. It was everything I had been working toward for 4 years, the final piece of a puzzle that had consumed my thoughts and energy since the night she burned down my world. We have a position in our property management division. It involves cleaning rental units between tenants, dealing with maintenance issues, and handling tenant complaints. The work is physically demanding, and you'd be dealing with people who are often angry about their living conditions. Margaret's face went pale. She understood what I was offering her. A job cleaning the kind of rental properties she had once owned, dealing with the kind of tenants she had once exploited. She would be on the other side of every interaction she had ever had as a landlord, powerless instead of powerful, serving instead of being served. The pay is $12 an hour, I continued. No benefits for the first 6 months. You'd be on probation for 90 days, and your performance would be evaluated weekly. $12 an hour? Less than Margaret had probably spent on lunch during her socialite days. But it was a lifeline, and we both knew she was in no position to negotiate. When can I start? Monday, 7 a.m. Don't be late. Margaret nodded eagerly, pathetically grateful for the opportunity to scrub toilets and unclog drains for wages that wouldn't cover her monthly expenses. As she stood to leave, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Triumph, certainly. Justice, perhaps.
But also something that might have been sadness for the woman she could have been if she had chosen kindness over cruelty all those years ago. "Margaret," I called as she reached the door. She turned back, hope flickering in her eyes. "Don't disappoint me." The hope died, replaced by fear. She nodded once and walked out into the October afternoon, leaving me alone with the intoxicating taste of victory and the uncomfortable realization that revenge, even perfectly executed revenge, was a more complicated emotion than I had expected. Margaret's first day as my employee was everything I had imagined and more. I didn't supervise her directly, of course. That would have been too obvious, too cruel even for my carefully calibrated sense of justice. Instead, I assigned her to our most demanding property manager, a woman named Janet Rodriguez, who had worked her way up from custodial services and had no patience for people who thought they were above honest work. I received Janet's report that evening. Margaret had shown up on time, dressed in discount store work clothes that made her look like a costume version of herself. She had struggled with the physical demands of the job, clearly unused to bending, lifting, and scrubbing for hours at a time. But she hadn't complained, hadn't made excuses, and hadn't quit when faced with a backed-up toilet in a studio apartment that hadn't been cleaned in months. She's slow, Janet told me over the phone, but she's thorough, and she actually listens when you tell her how to do something, which is more than I can say for most of the people we hire. Margaret, it seemed, was learning humility one dirty toilet at a time. Over the following weeks, I found myself checking her progress with an attention that bordered on obsession. I reviewed her time cards, her performance evaluations, the reports from tenants who interacted with her. I was looking for signs of the old Margaret, evidence that this was all an elaborate performance designed to win my sympathy and David's financial support. But there was no performance. Margaret threw herself into her new life with the desperate energy of someone who understood that this job was all that stood between her and complete destitution. She learned to clean efficiently, to interact respectfully with tenants who were often rude or demanding, to complete maintenance requests that would have horrified her privileged sensibilities just months earlier. The transformation was remarkable and disturbing. Margaret was becoming the kind of person she had once looked down on, and she was doing it with a grace that I hadn't known she possessed. It complicated my feelings about her, introduced an element of respect that I hadn't expected and wasn't entirely comfortable with. David noticed the change in his mother immediately. Margaret no longer accepted his financial help, no longer hinted about her struggles, or made him feel guilty for her circumstances. She talked about her work with something that might have been pride, describing tenant interactions and maintenance challenges with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered purpose in unexpected places. "I'm proud of her," David told me one evening as we prepared dinner in our rebuilt kitchen. "I know the work is hard, and she's not used to it, but she's really trying. She seems almost happy." Happy? The word stuck in my throat like a bone. Margaret was supposed to be suffering, supposed to be learning what it felt like to lose everything and start over with nothing. She wasn't supposed to find meaning in the work I had given her as punishment. But perhaps that was the most sophisticated revenge of all. I had taken everything that made Margaret who she was, stripped away her wealth and status and social connections, and forced her to rebuild herself from scratch. The woman who emerged from that process was someone entirely different, someone who found satisfaction in completing tasks that the old Margaret would have considered beneath her dignity. I had destroyed Margaret Hartwell so completely that even she didn't mourn the person she used to be. The first real test came 3 months into her employment when Margaret was assigned to clean an apartment that had been trashed by evicted tenants. The place was a disaster, with holes punched in the walls, carpet stained beyond repair, and bathroom fixtures that had been deliberately damaged. It was the kind of job we usually assign to our most experienced workers, people who had been dealing with property damage for years. Janet called me that afternoon, her voice tight with frustration. "I think I might have given your mother-in-law more than she can handle. The Morrison Street apartment is a nightmare, and she's been in there for 6 hours without asking for help or taking a real break." I drove to the property immediately, not entirely sure what I expected to find. Margaret collapsed from exhaustion, finally pushed past her breaking point and ready to quit. The old Margaret re-emerging to complain about the indignity of it all. Instead, I found her methodically repairing drywall damage with supplies she had purchased with her own money. Her work clothes were filthy, her hair was pulled back in a bandana that made her look like any other maintenance worker, and she was humming softly as she worked. She looked up when I entered, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she gestured to the wall she had been patching. "It's going to need paint," she said matter-of-factly. "Probably 2 coats to cover the stains. But the bones of the place are good. Someone's going to love living here once it's fixed up." Someone's going to love living here. Margaret was talking about the apartment with genuine affection, as if she could envision the life that would unfold within its walls once her work was complete.
It was the perspective of someone who understood that homes matter, that the places people live shape their daily experience and their sense of self-worth. The old Margaret had seen rental properties as income streams, numbers on a balance sheet that generated money without much thought for the human lives they contained. This Margaret saw potential homes, spaces that could provide shelter and dignity to people who deserved better than what they could afford. You didn't have to buy supplies with your own money, I said. I know, but I wanted to do this right, and we didn't have the right materials in the truck. It's only $30. I can afford it. $30. Margaret was talking about $30 like it was a significant expense, which for someone making $12 an hour, it was. She had gone from a world where $30 was a rounding error to one where it represented hours of hard labor. And yet she had spent it willingly because doing the job right was more important to her than maximizing her take-home pay. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. Why do you care so much about getting this perfect? Margaret sat back on her heels, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I spent years treating places like this as nothing more than business investments. I never thought about the people who would live in them, never cared whether they felt safe or comfortable or proud of their homes. I was making money off their need for shelter without caring whether I was providing something worth the rent they paid. She gestured to the apartment around us, to the careful repairs she had been making for hours. Now I see what it really costs when landlords don't care about their properties. I see what it does to people when they can't afford anything better than places that aren't maintained, aren't respected, aren't treated like homes where human beings are supposed to live. Margaret stood up, brushing dust off her pants with hands that were calloused, marked by months of physical labor. I can't undo the way I used to treat people, but I can make sure that every place I work on now is somewhere I would be willing to live myself. The transformation was complete. Margaret hadn't just learned to do the work, she had internalized the values that made the work meaningful. She had developed empathy for the people she served, respect for the labor she performed, and pride in contributing something positive to the world. It was the most thorough destruction of a human being I had ever witnessed, and I was responsible for every moment of it. Over the following months, Margaret's reputation within the company grew. Tenants requested her specifically when they needed maintenance work, not just because she was skilled, but because she treated them with genuine respect and courtesy. Property managers fought to have her assigned to their buildings because they knew she would go above and beyond what was required. She became, quite literally, the person she should have been all along.
The irony wasn't lost on me. In my quest to punish Margaret for her cruelty, I had accidentally given her the opportunity to become someone worth respecting. The revenge I had planned so carefully had backfired in the most unexpected way possible. But perhaps that was justice too. Perhaps the real punishment for someone like Margaret wasn't suffering, but growth. Perhaps the cruelest thing I could do to the woman who had burned down my life was to force her to become someone capable of understanding exactly how much damage she had caused. The revelation came on a rainy Thursday in February, almost 5 years after the fire that had started everything. I was working late in my office when Janet knocked on my door, looking troubled. "We need to talk about Margaret," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. My stomach tightened. After months of exemplary performance, had Margaret finally reverted to her old behaviors? Had she been caught treating tenants poorly or demanding special treatment because of her family connection? What happened? She came to me today and asked to be assigned to the Riverside Apartments complex. The Riverside Apartments, the worst properties in our portfolio, a collection of buildings in a neighborhood that had been declining for decades. The apartments were cheap because they were barely habitable, and they attracted tenants who were often dealing with addiction, mental illness, or criminal histories. It was the kind of assignment we usually reserved for our most experienced workers, people who could handle the physical dangers and emotional challenges of serving the city's most vulnerable populations. Did you tell her no? I tried to, but she was insistent. Said she'd been thinking about it for weeks, said she wanted to work where she could make the biggest difference. Make the biggest difference? Margaret was volunteering for the hardest, most thankless work in our entire operation because she wanted to help people who needed it most. "There's something else," Janet continued.
She's been using her own money to buy supplies for tenants. Small stuff, mostly, light bulbs, batteries, basic toiletries. Nothing expensive, but it adds up. I tried to tell her she didn't need to do that, but she said some of these people are barely getting by, and she wants to help however she can. Margaret was spending her own meager wages to provide comfort items for people who had even less than she did. The woman who had once hoarded wealth and status was now giving away what little she had to ease the suffering of strangers. How long has this been going on? A few months, maybe longer. I only found out because one of the tenants at Maple Street called to specifically thank her for replacing the burned-out hallway bulbs with her own money. Said it was the first time in years that anyone had cared enough to make the building feel safe at night. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions swirling through me. Pride in Margaret's transformation, anger at how long it had taken her to develop basic human decency, confusion about what this meant for the carefully constructed narrative of revenge I had been living with for years. Janet, I need you to do something for me. Give Margaret the Riverside assignment, but make sure she has everything she needs. Good supplies, backup support, whatever it takes to keep her safe while she's working there. Are you sure? It's a rough area, and she's not exactly a young woman. I'm sure. And Janet, give her a raise, $15 an hour. After Janet left, I sat alone in my office staring out at the city lights and trying to make sense of what I was feeling. Margaret's transformation should have been satisfying. I had taken everything from her and forced her to rebuild herself as someone better, kinder, more useful to the world. It was a more complete victory than I had ever imagined possible. So why did it feel so hollow? The answer came to me slowly, reluctantly. Margaret's growth had made my revenge irrelevant. I had spent years planning her destruction, orchestrating her downfall, savoring every moment of her humiliation. But the woman she had become through that process was someone I couldn't hate, couldn't dismiss, couldn't even dislike. I had destroyed my enemy so thoroughly that she no longer existed, replaced by someone who might actually deserve respect. The final confrontation came 6 months later, on the anniversary of the fire that had consumed my old life. Margaret asked to speak with me privately, and we met in the same Pioneer Square Starbucks where she had first begged me for employment. But this Margaret was different from the desperate woman who had sat across from me a year and a half earlier. She carried herself with quiet confidence, the assurance of someone who had found her place in the world through hard work and honest contribution. Her clothes were still simple, still clearly purchased on a limited budget, but they were clean and well-maintained, worn with dignity rather than shame. "I know what you did," she said without preamble, her hands steady on the table between us. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. "What are you talking about?" "The fire, my properties, the lawsuit, the tax audit, all of it." Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact, without anger or accusation. "It took me a long time to piece it together, but I'm not stupid, Aurora. I know you destroyed my life, just like I destroyed yours." For a moment, I considered denying it. The web I had woven was complex enough that proving my involvement would be difficult, if not impossible. But looking into Margaret's eyes, I realized that lies were no longer necessary. She knew the truth, and somehow that felt like a relief. "Yes," I said simply. Margaret nodded, as if my confirmation was exactly what she had expected. "I want you to know that I'm grateful." Of all the responses I might have anticipated, gratitude wasn't among them. I stared at her, speechless. "I was a terrible person," Margaret continued. "Cruel, selfish, completely indifferent to the suffering I caused. I treated you horribly because I thought you were beneath me, thought David deserved better than someone from your background. I was wrong about everything that mattered." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving mine. "You could have just cut me out of David's life. You could have turned him against me, convinced him to stop speaking to me entirely. But instead, you gave me the chance to become someone better. You forced me to understand what it means to struggle, to work hard, to treat other people with respect and kindness." Margaret's voice grew stronger, more certain. "The woman I was before deserved everything you did to her, but the woman I am now exists because of what you did to her. You didn't just take my old life away, you gave me a new one worth living."
I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, emotions I couldn't name threatening to overwhelm me. This wasn't how revenge was supposed to work. The victim wasn't supposed to thank their destroyer. The enemy wasn't supposed to emerge stronger and better from their defeat. "I spent 5 years hating you," I whispered. "I know. And I spent most of my life being someone worth hating. But we're both different people now, aren't we?" She was right. The Aurora who had sat in this same cafe 18 months ago, drunk on the power of Margaret's desperation, was as gone as the Margaret who had burned down my life. We had both been transformed by the fire we had set for each other, forged into something new by the heat of our mutual destruction. "What happens now?" I asked. Margaret smiled, and for the first time in all the years I had known her, it was a smile without calculation or hidden meaning. "Now, we go forward as the people we've become, instead of the people we used to be. I keep working, keep trying to make amends for the person I was, and you decide whether the woman sitting across from you is someone you can forgive." Forgiveness? I had never considered it as a possibility, never imagined a scenario where forgiveness would be relevant or necessary. But Margaret was right. The person I had set out to destroy no longer existed. In her place was someone who had earned the right to ask for something I had never thought she deserved. I looked at Margaret's face, mapped with lines that spoke of hard work and honest exhaustion, her hands marked by labor that had taught her the value of serving others. She had paid for her cruelty with everything she once valued, and emerged from that payment as someone worth respecting. "I forgive you," I said, and meant it completely. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Thank you. That means more than you'll ever know." We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, two women who had traveled through hell to reach this moment of understanding. Outside the coffee shop, Seattle bustled with its usual energy, but inside our corner of the world, something had shifted permanently. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as we prepared to leave. "I want to tell David the truth. About the fire, about everything. He deserves to know who his mother really was and who his wife really is." The thought of David learning about my carefully orchestrated revenge campaign should have terrified me. But sitting across from Margaret, seeing the woman she had become, I realized that I was tired of carrying secrets, tired of the weight of justified hatred, tired of being defined by the worst thing that had ever happened to me. "We'll tell him together," I said. That evening, David listened in stunned silence as Margaret and I took turns explaining the events of the past 5 years. The fire she had set, the revenge I had planned, the systematic destruction of her life, and the accidental reconstruction of her character. When we finished, David sat quietly for a long time, processing information that redefined everything he thought he knew about the two most important women in his life. Finally, he looked at his mother. "You really burned down our house?" Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I did. I was angry and jealous, and I wanted Aurora gone from your life. I thought if I took away everything that reminded you of her background, her family, you might realize you deserved someone better." Then David turned to me. "And you spent 5 years destroying her because of it?" "I did. I wanted her to know what it felt like to lose everything, to start over with nothing. I wanted her to understand the damage she had caused." David rubbed his temples, the gesture of a man trying to reconcile two versions of reality that couldn't possibly coexist. "I should be angry," he said finally. "I should be furious at both of you for the secrets, the lies, the ways you used me without my knowledge." Margaret and I waited, holding our breath. "But I can't be angry at the people you've become. Mom, you're kinder now than you've ever been in your entire life. You've learned to see people as human beings instead of obstacles or accessories. And Aurora, you've shown mercy and wisdom that I'm not sure I would have been capable of." He reached for both our hands, connecting the three of us in a circle that had once been broken by hatred and mistrust. "I love both of you, not despite what you've done, but because of who you've become through doing it. Maybe that makes me crazy, but there it is." That night, as David and I lay in bed in the house we had rebuilt from Margaret's ashes, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 5 years.
peace. Complete, profound peace. The woman who had destroyed my life was gone, replaced by someone I could respect and even like. The woman who had spent years planning elaborate revenge was also gone, replaced by someone who understood that the most powerful victories come not from destroying your enemies, but from giving them the opportunity to become worthy of forgiveness. Margaret continued working for my company, but our relationship shifted from employer and employee to something more complex and ultimately more honest. She became someone I could rely on, someone whose judgment I trusted, someone whose growth reminded me that people are capable of fundamental change when the circumstances demand it. The Riverside Apartments became her specialty, the place where she worked with the city's most forgotten residents. She developed programs for job training, addiction recovery, and basic life skills. She used her decades of privilege and social connections to advocate for better city services, improved public transportation, and policies that treated poor people with dignity rather than suspicion. Margaret Hartwell became everything she should have been from the beginning, and I had the strange privilege of watching her transformation from the inside. Years passed. David's architectural firm flourished. My law practice expanded into social justice work, representing tenants against predatory landlords and fighting for housing rights. Margaret's programs at Riverside became a model for other cities, proof that treating vulnerable people with respect and providing them with real opportunities could break cycles of poverty and despair. We became, improbably, a family. Not the family any of us had expected, but the family we had forged through fire and forgiveness, destruction and reconstruction, revenge and ultimately redemption. The last time I visited the site where our original house had stood, I found Margaret there before me. She came to this place sometimes, she told me, to remember who she used to be and to promise that person's victims that she would never stop trying to make amends. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked her. "The life you had before, the security, the status?" Margaret considered the question seriously, as she always did. "I regret the person I was," she said finally. "I regret the pain I caused, the opportunities I wasted, the years I spent being someone unworthy of love or respect. But I don't regret losing the things that made me that person. Money, status, power over others, those things didn't make me happy. They just made me cruel." She gestured to the empty lot where our old house had been, where wildflowers now grew in soil that had once been ash. "You know what I've learned? Fire doesn't just destroy. It clears away what's dead and overgrown so new things can grow. What happened between us, all of it cleared away the dead parts of who we were and gave us the chance to become something better." Standing there in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the beauty that had grown from destruction, I understood that Margaret was right. We had both been consumed by flames of our own making, and we had both emerged transformed. The fire that had started with hatred had ended with redemption. The revenge that had begun with destruction had concluded with reconstruction. The enemy who had tried to erase me from her son's life had become the woman who taught me that forgiveness is not weakness, but the ultimate expression of strength. Some stories end with victory, others end with defeat, but the best stories, the ones that change everyone involved, end with transformation. This was one of those stories, and I was grateful, finally, to have lived it. 10 years had passed since that afternoon in Pioneer Square when Margaret and I had laid our weapons down and chosen understanding over warfare. A decade of birthdays and holidays, of shared dinners and quiet conversations, of watching David build the architectural firm that now bore his name across 3 states. 10 years of learning that some victories are so complete they transform everyone involved, including the victor. Margaret was 79 now, still working part-time at the Riverside complex, though I had tried to convince her to retire completely. Her hair had gone completely silver, worn in a practical bun that spoke of someone who had long ago stopped caring about appearances and focused instead on substance. The lines around her eyes were deeper, carved by laughter as much as time, and her hands bore the permanent calluses of someone who had spent the better part of a decade in honest labor. She moved more slowly these days, but with a confidence that the old Margaret had never possessed. People recognized her on the street now, not as the society matron she had once been, but as the woman who had revolutionized tenant services at low-income housing complexes across the Pacific Northwest. Social workers and city council members sought her advice. Graduate students interviewed her for dissertations on community organizing and grassroots reform. Margaret Hartwell had become someone worth knowing, and the irony still took my breath away sometimes. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, the kind of gray Seattle day that makes you grateful for indoor heating and hot coffee. I was in my office, reviewing a case involving predatory lending practices, when my phone rang with the distinctive tone I had assigned to Margaret's number. "Aurora, I need to see you today. Something's happened." Her voice carried an urgency that immediately put me on alert. Margaret had learned to handle most crises with calm competence over the years, so whatever had prompted this call was serious. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, but there's something I need to show you, something that changes everything we thought we knew. Can you meet me at the house?" The house. She meant David's in my current home, the one we had built on the lot where our original house had stood. We had purchased the empty land 3 years ago, not out of nostalgia, but because David wanted to create something beautiful where something terrible had happened. The new house was larger than its predecessor, designed with walls of glass that brought the outside in and filled every room with light. I found Margaret in our kitchen, sitting at the breakfast bar with a manila folder in front of her and an expression I couldn't quite read. She had let herself in with the spare key we had given her years ago, back when our relationship shifted from employer and employee to something more like family. "What's in the folder?" I asked, settling onto the stool beside her. "Evidence," she said simply. "Evidence that I wasn't the only one responsible for the fire that started all of this." The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Margaret had confessed to arson years ago, had taken full responsibility for the destruction of our home and everything in it. The case was closed, the truth acknowledged, the consequences accepted by everyone involved. "What are you talking about?" Margaret opened the folder and spread its contents across the granite countertop. Insurance documents, fire investigator reports, correspondence I had never seen before. At the center of it all was a letter written in handwriting I didn't recognize. "Yesterday, I received a package at my apartment, no return address, postmarked from Portland. Inside was this letter and copies of all these documents." I picked up the letter, noting the expensive stationery and the careful script that spoke of someone who had been educated in an era when penmanship mattered. "Dear Mrs. Hartwell," it began, "I am writing to you because I can no longer live with what I know about the fire that destroyed your son's home 10 years ago. I am dying, and I want to clear my conscience before I face whatever judgment awaits me." My hands began to tremble as I continued reading. "My name is Eleanor Matsutomo, and I was your neighbor on Beacon Hill for 37 years. You probably remember me as the woman who always complained about noise and property maintenance issues. What you don't know is that I harbored deep resentments against you and your family, particularly your daughter-in-law, Aurora." I looked up at Margaret, who was watching my face carefully. "Keep reading," she said quietly. "I was present the day you went to check on David's house, the day of the fire. I saw you arrive, saw you go inside with cleaning supplies and what I assumed were materials for minor repairs. What I didn't tell anyone, what I've kept secret for all these years, is that I also went into that house after you left." The letter continued in the same careful script, but I could sense the writer's growing agitation in the slight tremor of certain words. I had been watching Aurora for months, documenting what I considered to be the decline of the neighborhood since she and David moved in. Different people coming and going, changes to the landscaping that I felt were inappropriate, music and cooking smells that seemed foreign and unwelcome. I convinced myself that she was a bad influence, that David would be better off without her. I felt sick, recognizing the casual racism that had probably surrounded me for years without my awareness. Eleanor Matsutomo had been watching me, judging me, finding me wanting based on nothing more than my heritage and her own prejudices. When I learned that Aurora's mother had died and she had gone to Arizona for the funeral, I saw it as an opportunity. I had a key to the house, one I had obtained years earlier when I volunteered to water their plants during a vacation. I told myself I was just going to look around, to see if there was evidence of the moral decay I was certain existed behind their respectable facade. Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand as I continued reading. But when I got inside and began going through Aurora's belongings, I found something that enraged me beyond all reason. Photo albums full of family pictures, documents showing how her relatives had come to America with nothing and built successful lives through hard work and sacrifice. Evidence of exactly the kind of American dream story that I had been taught to respect and admire.
The handwriting grew more erratic as Eleanor's confession continued. I realized that my hatred of Aurora had nothing to do with her character or her worthiness to be part of this community. It had everything to do with my own failures, my own inability to build the kind of meaningful life that she had created with David. I was a bitter old woman who had spent decades nursing grievances instead of nurturing relationships. I set the letter down for a moment, overwhelmed by the implications of what I was reading. Margaret had spent years believing herself solely responsible for destroying my life, had rebuilt herself around that guilt and the need to make amends. But she hadn't been acting alone that day. "There's more," Margaret said gently. I picked up the letter again, dreading what was coming next. In my rage and self-hatred, I began systematically destroying Aurora's most precious belongings. I told myself I was saving David from a woman who didn't deserve him, but I knew even then that I was acting out of pure malice. I poured cooking oil on her photo albums, used lighter fluid to accelerate the burning of her grandmother's quilt, made sure that anything connecting her to her heritage would be completely consumed. Eleanor's confession continued with surgical precision, detailing exactly how she had moved through our house, destroying the irreplaceable while leaving David's possessions carefully untouched. "When I heard you coming back, Mrs. Hartwell, I hid in the basement until you discovered the fires I had set. I watched through the window as you tried to save what you could, as you called the fire department, as you did everything possible to minimize the damage I had caused. You weren't committing arson that day. You were trying to clean up after mine." The world had gone completely silent around me. For 10 years, Margaret had carried the guilt of destroying my life, had transformed herself completely in response to that guilt. But she had been trying to stop a fire, not start one. She had been attempting to salvage what she could from Eleanor's destruction, not creating destruction herself. I let you take the blame because it was easier than facing my own culpability. You had been unkind to Aurora, had made no secret of your disapproval of her marriage to David. When the investigation suggested arson, when suspicion naturally fell on you, I said nothing. I let an innocent woman carry the responsibility for my crime. I looked up at Margaret, seeing her through completely new eyes. For 10 years, I had orchestrated her punishment for a crime she didn't commit. I had systematically destroyed her life, forced her into poverty and humiliation, all while congratulating myself on delivering poetic justice to someone who deserved retribution. Margaret had suffered through years of backbreaking labor, social humiliation, and financial hardship for someone else's crime. And she had accepted it all without complaint, had even thanked me for the opportunity to become a better person through adversity. "I'm dying now," Eleanor's letter continued. "Lung cancer, the doctors say. I have perhaps 3 months left, and I want to use that time to try to repair some of the damage I've caused. I've included copies of all the documents that prove Margaret's innocence and my guilt. I've also written similar letters to the fire department and the insurance company." The letter concluded with Eleanor's full confession, notarized and witnessed, along with a detailed timeline that proved Margaret had been at the house for less than 30 minutes before the fire was discovered, far too little time to cause the extensive damage that had been documented. Margaret reached into the folder and pulled out additional documents that supported Eleanor's account. Credit card receipts showing Margaret's purchase of cleaning supplies that morning, a receipt from a nearby grocery store time-stamped just 20 minutes before she called the fire department, phone records showing she had tried to call David immediately upon discovering the fire, then called 911 within minutes. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. Margaret Hartwell had been innocent all along. I stared at the documents spread across our kitchen counter, feeling as if the foundation of my entire adult life had just shifted beneath my feet. Every choice I had made for the past decade had been based on a lie. Every moment of satisfaction I had felt at Margaret's downfall had been undeserved. Every instance of her gratitude for the opportunity to grow had been heartbreaking in its misplaced appreciation. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper.
Since yesterday afternoon. I've read through everything a dozen times, hoping I might find some error, some detail that would prove Eleanor was lying to ease her own conscience. But it all fits, Aurora. The timeline, the evidence, even the specific details about which of your belongings were destroyed and how. Margaret's voice was calm, almost gentle, as if she was trying to cushion the impact of information that rewrote our entire shared history. I spent 10 years punishing you for something you didn't do. Yes, I destroyed your life for no reason. Yes, I turned you into my employee, forced you to clean toilets and unclog drains and beg for work, all while believing I was delivering justice to someone who deserved it. Margaret reached over and took my hands in hers, her fingers warm and steady despite the magnitude of what we were discussing. Aurora, look at me. I raised my eyes to meet hers, expecting to see anger, resentment, accusation. Instead, I found the same calm acceptance that had characterized her response to every challenge she had faced over the past decade. What you did to me, the way you systematically dismantled my life, it was wrong. It was based on false information, and it caused me tremendous hardship and humiliation. I nodded, tears beginning to blur my vision. But it was also the best thing that ever happened to me. The words hit like a physical blow. I stared at Margaret, certain I had misheard her. What? Aurora, before the fire, before you took everything away from me, I was a terrible person. Genuinely, objectively terrible. I was cruel to you, cruel to tenants, cruel to service workers, cruel to anyone I considered beneath my notice. I lived in a bubble of privilege and entitlement that insulated me from any understanding of how most people actually live. Margaret's grip on my hands tightened slightly. Even if Eleanor hadn't written this letter, even if I had gone to my grave believing I was responsible for destroying your home, I would still consider these past 10 years the most meaningful of my entire life. You didn't just take away my money and status. You gave me the opportunity to discover who I actually am when everything superficial is stripped away. I was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions swirling through me. Guilt for the years of punishment Margaret hadn't deserved. Anger at Eleanor for allowing an innocent woman to suffer for her crimes. Confusion about how to process a decade of decisions that had been based on false premises. I don't understand how you can forgive me for what I did to you. Margaret smiled, and it was the same genuine expression of warmth that had surprised me so often over the years. Because you gave me a life worth living. Before, I was wealthy but empty, privileged but meaningless. I had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. Now I have work that makes a difference, relationships built on genuine respect rather than social obligation, and the knowledge that I've spent the last years of my life trying to heal damage rather than cause it. She gestured toward the documents scattered across our counter. This letter doesn't change any of that. It doesn't make the work I've done less valuable or the growth I've experienced less real. It just means that the catalyst for my transformation came from injustice rather than justice, but the transformation itself is still authentic. Over the following days, as news of Eleanor's confession spread through legal and insurance circles, I found myself struggling with questions that had no easy answers. Should I feel guilty about punishing an innocent woman? Should I be angry about the decade of misdirected revenge? Should I somehow try to compensate Margaret for the suffering she hadn't deserved? Margaret herself seemed largely untroubled by these philosophical concerns. She continued her work at Riverside, continued her advocacy for tenant rights, continued living the life she had built from the ashes of her former existence. The revelation of her innocence didn't change her daily routine or her sense of purpose, but it changed everything for me. I found myself revisiting every interaction we'd had over the past 10 years, reframing every moment of her gratitude and growth through the lens of her undeserved suffering. The woman I had admired for accepting responsibility for her actions had actually been accepting responsibility for someone else's actions while remaining gracious and dignified throughout her punishment. It was humbling in ways I hadn't expected. David took the news with the same measured thoughtfulness that characterized all his major decisions. He was angry at Eleanor, certainly, and frustrated that his mother had suffered unnecessarily. But like Margaret, he seemed more focused on moving forward than dwelling on past injustices. The person Mom became over the past 10 years, that's real. he told me one evening as we walked through the neighborhood where Eleanor had once lived and plotted. Whether she deserved what happened to her or not, she used the experience to become someone better. That has value independent of whether the experience was justified. We stopped in front of Eleanor's old house, now occupied by a young family with children who played in the yard where she had once maintained obsessive control over every blade of grass. The new owners had painted the house a cheerful yellow and filled the garden with wildflowers that would have horrified the woman who had orchestrated so much pain from behind these windows. "Do you think she's right?" I asked David, about the transformation being worth the injustice. "I think that's for Mom to decide, not us, and she's been pretty clear about how she feels." That weekend, Margaret invited David and me to join her for the Riverside Complex's 10th anniversary celebration. The event had grown from a small tenant gathering to a major community festival, with local politicians, social workers, and representatives from other housing organizations coming to learn about programs that had become models for cities across the country. I watched Margaret move through the crowd with quiet confidence, greeting tenants who had become friends, introducing David and me to colleagues who clearly respected her expertise and judgment. Children who had grown up in the complex over the past decade hugged her legs and showed off school projects, while teenagers who had participated in her job training programs updated her on their college applications and career plans. This was the life that had grown from the ashes of her undeserved punishment, the community that had flourished because a bitter neighbor's racist hatred had intersected with my misdirected revenge in ways that ultimately created something beautiful. During the evening's program, several speakers talked about Margaret's impact on their lives. A young mother credited her with helping secure stable housing after a domestic violence situation. A formerly homeless veteran described how her job training program had given him skills and dignity. A college student talked about the scholarship fund Margaret had established using money she had saved from her modest salary over the years. When Margaret was called to the podium to accept a community service award, she spoke briefly about the importance of treating every person with dignity regardless of their circumstances, about the power of believing in people's potential for growth and change, about the way small acts of kindness could ripple outward to transform entire communities. She didn't mention the fire, didn't reference her own transformation, didn't hint at the complex chain of events that had brought her to this moment. She simply talked about the work and the people she served, about the future they were building together. After the ceremony, as we walked back to our car through streets that had been transformed by a decade of focused community investment, Margaret linked her arms through David's and mine. "I have something to tell you both," she said, her tone carrying the same weight it had held the day she revealed Eleanor's letter. We stopped under a streetlight that illuminated a small park where children played on equipment that hadn't existed when Margaret first started working in the neighborhood. "I've been offered a position with the National Housing Coalition. They want me to travel around the country helping other cities develop programs similar to what we've built here." David and I exchanged glances. Margaret was 79 years old, had spent the past decade doing physically demanding work that would challenge someone half her age. The idea of her taking on a national role that would require extensive travel and even more responsibility seemed both exciting and concerning. "What did you tell them?" "That I need to think about it. This neighborhood, these people, they've become my family. The idea of leaving them feels like abandonment." I looked around at the community that had grown up around Margaret's work, at the tangible evidence of what could be accomplished when someone dedicated themselves completely to serving others. "What if you didn't have to choose?" I asked. "What if we could find a way for you to take the national position while maintaining your connection to Riverside?" Over the following weeks, we developed a plan that would allow Margaret to split her time between national advocacy work and her local community. My law firm would sponsor a fellowship program that brought her back to Seattle regularly, while also supporting her travel and work with other cities. David's architectural firm would partner with the Housing Coalition to design innovative community spaces that incorporated lessons learned from the Riverside model. It was the kind of collaborative approach that reflected everything we had learned about the power of working together rather than against each other. On the day Margaret left for her first national assignment, I drove her to the airport and walked her to the security checkpoint. At 79, she was embarking on a new chapter of her life that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier, when she was struggling to learn how to clean apartments and treat tenants with basic respect. "I want you to know something," I told her as we waited for her boarding announcement. "Eleanor's letter, the truth about the fire, it doesn't change anything important. You became someone worth admiring through your own choices, your own growth, your own determination to be better than you were." Margaret smiled and adjusted the strap of her carry-on bag, a practical piece of luggage that spoke of someone who had learned to travel light and focus on essentials. "And I want you to know something too," she replied. "The woman who spent 10 years orchestrating my punishment with such precision and determination, she's someone I've come to love and respect. Not despite what you did to me, but because of the complexity and thoughtfulness you brought to everything, even revenge." She paused, looking out at the planes preparing for departure beyond the terminal windows. "We both became better people through this experience, Aurora. We both learned things about ourselves and each other that we couldn't have discovered any other way. Maybe that's worth more than being right about who was responsible for what." As I watched Margaret disappear into the security line, headed for a life of national recognition and meaningful work that had grown directly from the injustice I had inflicted upon her, I realized that some stories don't have simple moral conclusions. Some experiences are too complex to be reduced to questions of right and wrong, victim and perpetrator, justice and injustice. Margaret and I had hurt each other, had misunderstood each other, had spent years locked in a battle that was based on incomplete information and misdirected anger. But we had also transformed each other in ways that ultimately created more good than harm, more growth than destruction, more love than hatred. The fire that had started our war had been set by a bitter neighbor who died with her secrets, but the fire that had forged our peace had been lit by our mutual willingness to become better than we had been. Years later, when Margaret's work with the National Housing Coalition had become the subject of academic studies and policy recommendations, when her programs had been implemented in dozens of cities across the country, when she had become someone whose life story inspired others to believe in the possibility of transformation at any age, I would sometimes think about Eleanor's letter and the truth it revealed. I would think about the 10 years Margaret spent believing herself guilty of a crime she didn't commit, and the grace with which she had accepted responsibility for something that wasn't her fault. I would think about my own certainty that I was delivering justice when I was actually perpetrating a different kind of injustice, and the way Margaret had turned even that wrong into something right. But mostly, I would think about the afternoon we spent in Pioneer Square, all those years ago, when Margaret had thanked me for destroying her life, and I had learned that revenge was far more complicated than I had ever imagined. Some fires consume everything they touch, leaving nothing but ash and regret. But others clear away what needs to be removed, so that something better can grow in its place. The fire between Margaret and me had done both, had destroyed and created in equal measure, had taught us that the most profound transformations often come through experiences we wouldn't choose, but ultimately wouldn't trade. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of all, that the stories we tell ourselves about justice and punishment, about right and wrong, about who deserves what, are often less important than our willingness to grow from whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. Margaret had grown from injustice into wisdom. I had grown from certainty into humility. And together, we had created something neither of us could have achieved alone, a relationship built not on the absence of harm, but on the presence of forgiveness, understanding, and the recognition that even our worst mistakes can become the foundation for our greatest contributions. The fire was over. The growth it had made possible was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.